A millionaire entered his son-in-law's house and saw his daughter cleaning the floor, wearing old, worn-out clothes. What she told him made him fall to his knees in tears in front of everyone. William Smith was a man who had reached the pinnacle of business success. He ran an empire with the same precision a surgeon wields a scalpel, cold, calculating, and ruthless. His name was synonymous with power and prestige, and his face graced the covers of business magazines as a model of triumph. Yet beneath the surface of this impeccable facade lay a profoundly lonely man, though he himself never acknowledged it. For William, luxury and respect were the pillars upon which he had built his life, but those around him respected him more out of fear than genuine admiration. In his imposing office, adorned with marble, fine woods, and works of art, William would often sit behind a glass desk, signing multi-million-dollar contracts as if they were minor formalities. He had learned to value numbers, transactions, and results, but the language of emotions and human connections had always eluded him. Despite his fortune and power, his personal life was an emotional desert, distant, barren, and filled with broken relationships he never bothered to mend. William took pride in having given everything to his family. In his view, a father fulfilled his duty by ensuring that they never lacked anything. He had paid for the best schools, bought houses, cars, and provided every imaginable comfort. Yet he never understood why, despite all this, the gratitude he expected from his wife and daughter never arrived. The family dinners they once shared were now absent from his life, replaced by occasional calls and superficial gatherings where words felt empty and the uncomfortable silences were almost unbearable. His mind often drifted to the past, to the days when Annie was a child. He vividly remembered the moments she would come running with excitement, showing off some school award or a perfect grade. Instead of sharing in her joy, William responded with a coldness that seemed calculated. "That's what's expected of you." To him, those words were a veiled acknowledgement, a reminder that she had to maintain high standards. But to Annie, they were daggers that pierced her young heart, making it clear that her father's love depended on her success. On one occasion, Annie had spent weeks practicing for a piano recital. On the night of the event, when she finally played before a packed hall, her hands trembled with nerves. Although the performance was a success and the audience rose to a standing ovation, William merely commented, "It was good, but you should work on your timing." From a young age, Annie learned that she would never be enough for him. Even though she kept striving, the shine of her achievements faded over time, like a flame smothered by the wind of indifference. In the present, William lived with the consequences of that distance. Annie, now an adult, was an enigma to him. The few times they spoke on the phone, their conversations were reduced to formal questions and brief answers. William felt uncomfortable whenever he tried to dig deeper, and Annie seemed to prefer keeping her distance. In his heart, William knew something was broken between them, but he never knew how to fix it. What could be said after so many years of accumulated silences and open wounds? The emotional void that consumed him at night was something he never admitted, not even to himself. Instead, he covered it up with layers of work, meetings, and success. But in the quiet moments, when he was alone in his luxurious apartment with panoramic city views, he felt a weight he couldn't explain. He looked at the childhood photos of Annie, framed and carefully placed on shelves, wondering how so much time had passed without them truly knowing each other. William Smith was a man who had everything, except for what truly mattered. Annie Smith looked out the window of her modest apartment, where the first rays of sunlight were just beginning to illuminate the empty streets on the outskirts of the city. With 2 small children to care for, her day always began before dawn. While the kids slept soundly in their rooms, she was already in the kitchen, preparing breakfast and making sure everything was ready before the daily routine took shape. Her life, although marked by sacrifice, was filled with moments that, despite everything, made her feel fulfilled. Her children's cheerful hugs upon waking, the grateful smile of Sebastian, her husband, every time she handed him a cup of coffee. But those small joys could not erase the weight of her exhaustion, nor the silent loneliness that accompanied her every step. Sebastian's accident, which had left him permanently disabled, had transformed her life. What was once a family maintained with effort, but with hope, had become a daily struggle for survival. Annie's days merged between the demands of her home and the requirements of her part-time job. Every day seemed endless, and although there were moments when she managed to smile, the emotional fatigue was evident in her dark eyes and in the tired marks on her face. Every time she looked in the mirror, she saw the remains of the young woman who once dreamed of a different future, one filled with possibilities, without the burden of responsibility that life had placed upon her. Though the routine was relentless, Annie found strength deep within herself, in the unconditional love she felt for her family. The bond with her children was her greatest source of motivation. Her little ones, Julian and Olivia, represented the future, a reason to keep going amid the challenges. But the constant struggle to balance her professional and personal life, to remain strong in the face of adversity, left little room for herself. The nights were long, and her mind kept spinning as she wondered how to find more hours in the day to rest, or at least regain her strength. She often found herself questioning whether the decisions she had made in the past were the right ones. The distance from her father, William, had been inevitable, but had she done the right thing by rejecting the control he always tried to impose? The independence she gained after leaving him, though initially a source of pride, now weighed heavily on her. Her father's love, which was never the kind of love she needed, still haunted her in the form of unanswered questions. Sometimes, in the darkest moments, she wondered if it would have been different had she stayed by his side, if he would have understood and supported her in a different way. But the answers never came, and the distance between them remained unbridgeable. Even so, Annie never regretted having built her own life. Her independence, though burdened by sacrifices, allowed her to grow as a person. But that didn't mean she didn't feel the weight of the decisions she had to make every day. The love of her father was a distant shadow that sometimes returned at the hardest moments, when loneliness pressed in more tightly. In her home, Sebastian, though grateful for everything Annie did, could not help feeling frustrated by his own inability to contribute more. The family's economic situation was precarious, and debt was starting to creep into every corner. Sebastian, in his frustration, tried to help however he could, but his physical limitations prevented him from being the pillar he once was. Both looked at each other with tired eyes, yet still filled with love, aware that mutual support was all they had left to move forward. Despite everything, the love they shared gave them the strength to fight on, but Annie couldn't help wondering how much longer she could hold out. Life had not offered them the comforts Annie had known in her childhood, nor the stability many took for granted. She had sacrificed a life of luxury for one of hardship, and though she found solace in the love of her family, there were moments when she couldn't help feeling lost. Often, she lay down at the end of the day, when everyone else was asleep, and stared at the ceiling in search of answers that never came. The life she had chosen, though full of love, was also full of shortages. The children, in their innocence, represented both what she had gained and what she had lost. Their happiness and laughter were a source of light, but they also constantly reminded her of the price of that light, a life without the comforts she once imagined having. The burden was heavy, but Annie would not give up, not for herself, but for the little ones who depended on her. Yet deep down, part of her also longed to find a way out, a moment's respite, if only briefly. William Smith parked his luxury car in front of the modest building where Annie lived. He had decided to visit her without warning, driven by a feeling he couldn't fully identify: curiosity, worry, or maybe guilt. As he climbed the worn, narrow steps leading to his daughter's apartment, he couldn't help but notice the chipped walls and the hollow echo of the place, so different from the opulent spaces he was accustomed to. In his mind, he imagined he would find an orderly, welcoming home, a reflection of the values of perfection and discipline he had instilled in her since childhood. However, when he opened the door after a brief knock, the image that greeted him was an unexpected blow. The apartment was small and austere, and though it was clean, it reflected a life of struggle. In the middle of the living room, Annie was on her knees, cleaning up a spill on the floor with old clothes. She wore a worn-out t-shirt and simple pants, more functional than aesthetic. Nearby, her children played with broken toys, improvising a castle with uneven blocks. In the corner, Sebastian, in his wheelchair, struggled to reach an object on the table, frustration etched on his face. William stood motionless in the doorway, unable to process what he was seeing. He had imagined his daughter living differently, maybe not in luxury, but at least with a stability he always believed his influence would guarantee. This reality was a brutal contrast. Everything in that scene, the worn furniture, the evident fatigue in Annie's eyes, the quiet struggle in Sebastian's every movement, spoke of sacrifice, of hardship, of a life William would never have allowed for his daughter, at least not under his control. Upon hearing the door, Annie looked up and froze for a moment. Surprise was evident on her face, followed by a mix of embarrassment and something else, a contained defiance. She stood up quickly, setting aside the rag she was using to clean, and approached William, who still stood like a statue at the threshold. "Dad," she said, trying to sound calm, though her voice carried a note of uncertainty. "What are you doing here?" William did not reply immediately. His gaze wandered around the room, lingering on the details that unsettled him. The sofa with worn cushions, the toys mended with tape, Sebastian's wheelchair that seemed to need maintenance. Finally, his eyes settled on Annie's face. She was thinner than he remembered, and although her expression brimmed with strength, it was marked by profound exhaustion. "Is this where you live?" asked William, his tone mixing incredulity and disapproval. Annie nodded, folding her arms as if wanting to shield herself from her father's critical gaze. "Yes, Dad. This is where we live." William stepped further into the apartment, uninvited, and stopped again in the middle of the living room. The discomfort in the air was palpable. He looked at the children, who now watched him with curiosity from their play corner, and then at Sebastian, who had finally managed to grab what he needed and now kept his head down, avoiding his father-in-law's gaze. This isn't what I expected," he finally said, not bothering to hide his dismay. Annie lifted her chin. There was a flicker of pride in her eyes, despite the embarrassment she clearly felt at her father's unexpected visit. "Well, it's my life, Dad," she replied firmly. "It may not be what you expected, but it's what I've built with what I have." William felt her words pierce him like a dagger. How was it possible that his daughter, the one he had given everything she needed to succeed, was living like this? His mind filled with questions. What had gone wrong? Why had she chosen this path when he had offered her a future filled with possibilities? But more than anything, one question tormented him. Why hadn't he noticed the distance between them before? "Why did you let your life come to this?" he asked, his tone hardening almost against his will. Annie pressed her lips together, feeling the old wound of her father's criticism reopen. But this time, she wasn't a little girl seeking his approval. She was a woman who had learned to stand on her own, even in the midst of adversity. "I didn't let anything happen, Dad. I chose this life," she said calmly, though her voice trembled slightly at the end. "And even though it's not easy, I'm fine with it. There's love here, hard work, and something you never understood: freedom." The tension in the room was nearly tangible. From his corner, Sebastian watched Annie with a mixture of admiration and concern, while the children, oblivious to the weight of the conversation, kept playing. William, meanwhile, had no idea how to respond. For the first time in a very long time, the man who always had the last word found himself speechless. He looked at his daughter's face again, searching for any sign of weakness, but all he found was a determination that unsettled him. Here, in this humble home, William Smith realized for the first time that he did not understand Annie, that the daughter he had raised under unyielding standards had built something he could not comprehend, and that lack of understanding left him more vulnerable than he was willing to admit. "You chose this? You chose to live this way, struggling every day, when I gave you everything you needed to succeed?" he insisted, his voice growing slightly louder, as if trying to reassert his authority. Annie took a deep breath and looked him straight in the eye. There was no rage in her gaze, only a determination William had never seen in her before. "Yes, I chose it. I chose not to depend on you because I didn't want you controlling my life the way you always did. Here, at least, I know I'm building something of my own, even if it's with my bare hands." Her words struck William like a hammer. He had always believed he'd given his daughter everything she needed, an impeccable education, unlimited resources, a clear path to success. But now, at this very moment, he realized that his idea of support had always been conditioned by his need to control every aspect of Annie's life. He had never considered that she might want something different, something that didn't fit into his rigid vision of what a successful life meant. "With your bare hands," William repeated, his tone caught between astonishment and disbelief. "Annie, this isn't living. It's surviving." "And that's what I'm doing," she replied, without losing her composure. "But you know what? I prefer this. I prefer to fight every day and know I'm doing something on my own than live under your shadow, meeting your impossible expectations." From his position, Sebastian, who had been quietly listening, rolled his wheelchair slightly forward, as if preparing to intervene. But Annie raised a hand, stopping him. It was a small gesture, but firm enough to make it clear she didn't need anyone to speak for her. "Please, Sebastian, this is between my dad and me," she said, without even taking her eyes off William. William felt a stab of discomfort as he noticed how easily Annie took control of the conversation. The little girl who once desperately sought his approval now stood before him as a woman who did not ask for permission to justify her decisions. "I can't believe it," William murmured, running a hand through his hair in frustration. "I always thought I'd given you the best. I taught you to be strong, to never settle, to seek the best for yourself. And this is what you choose. You taught me to follow your rules, not to be strong," Annie retorted without hesitation. "I learned strength afterward, when I decided to walk away and build something of my own. And yes, Dad, maybe this house isn't perfect and things are tough, but here I'm free. Free to be who I want to be." The silence that followed was deafening. William looked at his daughter as if seeing her for the first time. She was not the Annie he remembered, the girl who always tried to please him, who sought his validation with every achievement. The woman standing before him now was someone entirely different, someone who needed no one's approval, and that threw him completely off balance. "So, is that what you wanted? A life of struggle?" he finally asked, his tone quieter, though still loaded with disbelief. "No, Dad. I didn't want this," Annie replied. "But I also didn't want a life where everything I did was conditioned by your expectations. Here, at least, I know that the sacrifices I make are mine, not anyone else's." Sebastian, still on the sidelines, watched as their conversation reached a critical moment of tension. For an instant, he considered interrupting again, but Annie's look convinced him that this was not his time to speak. William, on the other hand, slowly sat down on the couch, as if the weight of his own thoughts was too much for him to remain standing. "I don't understand," William admitted, more to himself than to Annie. "I simply don't understand." Annie approached him, not to comfort him, but to make it clear that although she respected him as her father, she would not yield on what she believed to be true. "I don't expect you to understand, Dad. I just want you to accept it. This is my life, and I wouldn't trade what I've built here, as imperfect as it is, for a version of success that was never truly mine." William raised his eyes toward her, and for the first time in years, he felt he had nothing left to say. Annie's words had opened a crack in the armor he'd built around his understanding of success, and the emptiness left by that crack was beginning to fill with uncomfortable introspection. That day, William Smith could not impose his will as he always had. For the first time, he was the one who had to face a reality he could not control. And that reality had a face, his daughters, who asked not for his approval, but for his respect. William remained seated on the worn sofa in the small living room, completely silent. This was an unusual state for a man used to dominating any conversation, to imposing his perspective with precise words and forceful decisions. But now, in the wake of Annie's words, he found himself trapped in a tangle of thoughts he had never before allowed into his mind. For the first time, he began to wonder if the distance between them wasn't simply a consequence of time or circumstances, but rather a direct result of how he'd raised her. For years, William had viewed Annie as an extension of himself, someone to be shaped according to his vision of success, a project destined for perfection. But now, watching her as she tidied the living room and tended to the children with a blend of patience and exhaustion, he realized he had never truly understood who his daughter was. He had spent so much time imposing expectations that he never stopped to ask her what she wanted, what she dreamed of, or who she wanted to become. William let his eyes roam around the room, lingering on small details he had previously overlooked. He observed Sebastian helping Julian build a tower of toy blocks, while Olivia, pencil in hand, drew intently on a worn piece of paper. On the surface, it all seemed so simple, almost insignificant. But there was something in the way they interacted that deeply moved him. Love. It was a love that required no grand words or ostentatious displays. It lived in the small gestures, in the way Annie placed a reassuring hand on Sebastian's shoulder when he showed frustration, in the children's spontaneous laughter as they built their little world with whatever they had. William felt a lump in his throat. This warm atmosphere, so full of life despite its difficulties, was something he had never experienced in his own home. When he thought of his own house, he remembered it as a cold place ruled by strict schedules and rigid goals. His success had always been the priority, and emotions were a distraction he could not afford. His marriage, once promising, had devolved into a distant, functional coexistence. His relationship with Annie had followed a similar path, interaction based on achievements and obligations, not affection or understanding. The contrast between his life and Annie's hit him with unexpected force. He, the powerful magnate who possessed everything, had never built a home that actually felt like one. And now, sitting in this modest apartment filled with broken toys and children's laughter, he was experiencing something he had never felt in his own life: warmth. Annie, unaware of her father's introspective gaze, continued her tasks. She picked up the cloth she'd been using to clean before their argument and took it to the kitchen. Each of her movements seemed calculated to maximize time and energy, as if she were constantly balancing the pieces of a complex puzzle. Still, even in her weariness, there was a strength in her that William couldn't ignore, a resilience he did not remember teaching her, but that now he recognized as her greatest achievement, one that had nothing to do with him. William remained there, observing it all as if in a dream. The sounds of the home, from Annie's quiet murmuring in the kitchen to the children's laughter and the dull clatter of blocks falling to the floor, seemed to envelop him in a reality he had never considered. Sitting on that couch, surrounded by a humble but loving environment, he felt for the first time in a long time that his success, what he had always considered his greatest triumph, might be just a facade masking something deeper: the emptiness left by his disconnection from the people who truly mattered. Night fell, and eventually the children said their goodnights and went to bed. Sebastian, with effort, wheeled himself toward their bedroom, leaving William alone in the living room. The apartment, now silent, felt strangely cozy. William looked around, pausing at a mirror hanging on one wall. His reflection brought him back to reality. In his own eyes, he no longer saw the invincible magnate he worked so hard to project, but a lost man, questioning every decision he had ever made. For the first time in years, William Smith felt small, not before the magnitude of his empire, but before the possibility that everything he had always deemed important might mean nothing at all. As the silence of the night enveloped him, one question remained in his mind. At what price had he built his success? The days William spent at Annie's home not only gave him a window into the life his daughter had forged, but also forced him to confront his own past. As he watched the dynamic between Annie, Sebastian, and the children, a series of buried memories began to surface. Every gesture Annie made toward her children, each word of encouragement, every tired but sincere smile, reminded him of something he himself had never offered. One quiet afternoon, while Annie prepared dinner in the small kitchen, William sat by the table, absent-mindedly looking at a drawing one of his grandchildren had left behind. The crooked lines and uneven colors formed a simple but cheerful depiction of their family. It was an unassuming picture, yet full of meaning. His restless mind drifted back to a moment in the past. Annie was 8 years old when she came running home from school, clutching a shiny trophy that barely fit in her little hands. Her eyes sparkled with excitement, and her smile lit up her face as she entered William's study. "Dad, I won first place in the math contest," she said, proudly showing him the trophy. William looked up from the papers on his desk. He observed the trophy for a few seconds before turning his gaze back to Annie. "That's what's expected of you," he responded, in a neutral, almost mechanical tone. "You're my daughter. I expected nothing less." Annie's enthusiasm vanished instantly. Her smile faded, but she nodded silently, holding the trophy close to her chest as if trying to protect it. "Thank you, Dad," she murmured before leaving the study. William hadn't thought about that moment again until now. In his mind, it had been a fair comment, a way to encourage Annie to keep striving. But now, sitting in his daughter's humble kitchen, he understood how much harm his indifference had caused. Instead of celebrating with her, he had turned her achievement into another expectation, another impossible standard to meet. Another memory surfaced, this time of a night when Annie had practiced for weeks for a piano recital. William had arrived home late from work, but she insisted on showing him the piece she had prepared. Her small hands trembled slightly as she played, yet the music filled the room with a delicacy that even William, a man not given to appreciating art, could not ignore. Still, when she finished, he merely pointed out a mistake. "You missed a note in the second section. You need to work on that if you want it to come out perfectly." Annie nodded in silence, her eyes fixed on the piano keys. She never mentioned that his comment kept her awake late that night, practicing in secret to correct a flaw he would likely forget by morning. As William remembered these moments, he felt a heaviness in his chest he had never experienced before. He had been physically present in Annie's life, but emotionally absent. In his eagerness to make her strong and successful, he had ignored the most fundamental needs of a child: love, support, and validation. Every time Annie tried to impress him, he responded with criticism or a cold comment, thinking it would motivate her. But now he saw that, instead of strengthening her, he had sown the seeds of an insecurity that might have followed her for years. Annie entered the room, interrupting his thoughts. She carried a plate in her hands, and despite her obvious exhaustion, gave him a polite smile that William knew wasn't entirely natural. "Are you all right, Dad?" she asked, noticing his distant expression. William nodded slowly, forcing a smile in return. "Yes. I'm just remembering things." Annie looked at him for a moment, as if trying to decipher what was going through his mind, but decided not to ask further. She returned to the kitchen, leaving William alone with his thoughts. As the smell of dinner filled the small home, William remained silent, lost in his memories. For the first time, he allowed himself to feel the remorse he had avoided for years. Each recollection, each moment in which he had failed as a father, stacked up in his mind like a crushing weight. He looked again at the child's drawing on the table. In its simplicity, the picture represented something he had never understood: the importance of unconditional love and support without strings attached. He realized he had demanded too much from Annie, not because he truly wanted the best for her, but because he saw her success as an extension of his own pride. Now, this realization filled him with profound sadness. The day ended with William sitting alone in the small living room, surrounded by a home that, although modest, was full of something he had never known how to offer: warmth. This introspection left him exhausted, but it also opened the door to something he had never considered before: the possibility of change. Dinner was over, and silence filled the small kitchen as Annie began clearing the dishes. William remained seated, watching her with a mix of concern and restrained frustration. Although the days he had spent in her home had allowed him a closer look at her daily struggles, his discomfort with her way of life had not diminished. On the contrary, every corner of the apartment, every sign of wear, seemed like a cry for help he could not ignore. When Annie finished stacking the plates in the sink, William reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a check. Without saying a word, he placed it on the center of the table, where she could clearly see it. "Use this to hire help or find a better place," he said firmly, as though dictating an inevitable solution. Annie froze, her gaze fixed on the check that now lay on the table. It was a considerable amount, enough to transform her life significantly. For a moment, she said nothing, and the silence in the room became palpable. William, interpreting her silence as acceptance, nodded slightly, as if the matter were settled. But when Annie looked up, her expression was not that of someone grateful for a solution. It was a blend of calm and resolve, a reflection of the strength William had witnessed in her ever since he arrived. "Thank you, Dad," she said at last, her tone gentle but firm. "But I can't accept this." William frowned, surprised by her response. "What do you mean you can't accept it?" he asked, disbelief evident in his voice. "It's to help you, so you can live better. Isn't that what you want?" Annie took a seat across from him, maintaining eye contact. Her hands rested on the table, and though her words carried no anger, her tone was filled with conviction. "I appreciate it, Dad, I really do. But I don't need your money. What I need is for you to understand that this is my life, and I'm fine with it." William leaned forward slightly, trying to find some crack in his daughter's stance that would allow him to persist. To him, money had always been the ultimate tool to solve problems, the key that opened every door. But this refusal, spoken with such serenity, profoundly baffled him. "Annie, why would you prefer to struggle like this when you have the solution right in front of you?" he asked, visibly irritated. "It makes no sense." Annie sighed, as if she had anticipated this reaction. She'd spent years dealing with her father's need to control her life, and although this time the control came disguised as generosity, she wouldn't let the old pattern repeat itself. "Because accepting this wouldn't just be taking your money, Dad. It would mean coming back under your control, and I promised myself I would never do that again." Her words hit like a hammer. William leaned back in his chair, processing what he had just heard. He had thought this gesture would be well received, a way to make up for lost time and ease the burden Annie carried each day. But now he understood that to her, the money wasn't merely helpful. It was a reminder of the influence he had always tried to exert. "I don't want to control you," he replied, more defensive than sincere. "I just want to help." "I know," Annie responded in a tone that suggested she didn't want to argue the point. "But to me, accepting this would mean depending on you again, and I'm not willing to do that. Not because I don't value what you're offering, but because I've worked very hard to get here, even if it's not perfect." William stared at her, searching for something in her words he could dispute. But there was no anger or resentment in her voice, only a simple, honest truth he couldn't deny. He realized that Annie wasn't rejecting his help out of pride, but out of something far deeper, the desire to own her own life, her own sacrifices, and her own achievements, however modest they might be. Silence stretched between them, and finally, William looked away. His fingers drummed on the table before he took the check and slipped it back into his jacket. He said nothing more about it, but frustration still burned inside him. "It's your decision," he finally said, attempting a neutral tone, though he couldn't fully hide his annoyance. Annie nodded, knowing she had won this small battle, yet also aware that the chasm between them wouldn't disappear easily. As she got up to continue her tasks, William remained seated, watching her with a mixture of bewilderment and respect. For the first time, he began to accept that Annie wasn't the little girl he'd tried to shape, but rather a woman with her own will, one who refused to yield, even if it meant facing hardship. Her refusal of his help not only frustrated him, it left him with a sense of emptiness he couldn't ignore. As much as he wanted to ease Annie's burden, he realized he couldn't solve her problems with the tools he'd always relied on. That night, as the sounds of the household faded, William understood that money, his most powerful resource, was useless here. This realization left him more vulnerable than ever. During the days William stayed in Annie's home, he began to notice in greater detail the complex dynamic between her and Sebastian. At first glance, it was clear they shared sincere love, yet there was also an underlying tension that surfaced in subtle ways. A fleeting look, a restrained comment, a prolonged silence. William, used to observing and analyzing in order to make decisions, began to unravel the layers of this relationship which, although solid, seemed laden with invisible difficulties. Sebastian, despite his efforts to stay involved, seemed distant at certain moments. When Annie returned from work, visibly exhausted, he tried to help however he could, handing her a glass of water, asking about her day, even taking care of small tasks around the home. Yet each gesture, though well-intentioned, seemed accompanied by a shadow of frustration, as if Sebastian couldn't help but feel inadequate. One afternoon, while Annie took the children to the park, William and Sebastian remained alone in the house. William was sitting on the sofa, leafing through a newspaper he'd found on the table, when Sebastian rolled his wheelchair over and stopped beside him. "May I ask you something?" Sebastian said, breaking the silence with a calm voice that still carried a clear note of unease. William looked at him, surprised by the direct question. "Of course," he replied, setting the newspaper aside. Sebastian was quiet for a moment, as if searching for the right words. Finally, he spoke. "Have you ever felt that you weren't enough for someone?" he asked, avoiding William's gaze, as his hands fidgeted nervously on the armrests of his chair. The question left William unsettled. He wasn't used to these kinds of conversations, much less to reflecting on his own feelings. However, there was something in Sebastian's tone that made him pause. This wasn't a casual question. It was a disguised confession. "I don't know if enough is the word," William answered after a moment cautiously. "But yes, I suppose I've had my moments of doubt, though not many, to be honest." Sebastian nodded, as if expecting that answer. Then he went on, this time with a frankness William hadn't anticipated. "Since the accident, I haven't stopped feeling like a burden to Annie and the kids. Before, I worked long hours so they'd never lack anything. I was proud of providing all they needed. But now I can't even help fix a broken toy without feeling like I'm failing them." William didn't know what to say immediately. Sebastian, eyes fixed on the floor, seemed to be pouring out a part of himself he'd kept hidden. It was a vulnerability William had never seen in him, one that unsettled him as much as it moved him. "Annie's never made you feel that way, has she?" William asked, trying to understand. "Never," Sebastian replied, looking up. "But that makes it worse. She carries everything, never complains. She gets up before everyone else, goes to bed after us, and keeps going as if nothing affects her. But I see it. I see how tired she is. And I know that, even if she never says it, my situation makes everything harder." William watched Sebastian in silence, trying to process his words. He had never stopped to consider the depth of Annie's sacrifices, not only in terms of physical and financial effort, but also the emotional burden of supporting a family so dependent on her. And now, seeing Sebastian, he understood that Annie wasn't just fighting external adversities. She was also contending with the insecurities of a man who loved her deeply, yet didn't know how to face his new reality. "I have to tell you something, Sebastian," William said at last, his tone gentler than usual. "Annie doesn't do what she does because she sees you as a burden. She does it because she loves you, because this family means everything to her. If there's one thing I've learned while being here, it's that the love you share is stronger than any obstacle." Sebastian looked at him skeptically, as if William's words were difficult to accept. "That sounds nice, but it doesn't change how I feel," Sebastian said, his voice trembling slightly. "It doesn't change the fact that every day I feel less useful." For the first time in years, William found himself without a ready answer. In his world, people's value and success had always been tied to their ability to meet high standards and ambitious goals. But in this context, those rules didn't apply. All he could do was nod, acknowledging Sebastian's pain without trying to minimize it. "I don't know what it's like to be in your position," William admitted, with an honesty unusual for him. "But I know Annie wouldn't be the woman she is without you. You might not see it now, but you give her strength too, even if it's in a way you don't recognize." Sebastian remained silent, processing William's words. For the first time, the father-in-law he'd always considered distant and critical had spoken with genuine empathy. Although it didn't solve his problems, it offered a small spark of comfort. That night, William withdrew to his room with a different feeling. For years, he'd measured people's worth by their capacity to meet expectations and achieve success. But now, reflecting on his conversation with Sebastian and Annie's constant sacrifice, he began to understand that a person's true value often lies not in their accomplishments, but in how they confront adversity and uphold those they love. This understanding, though still in its infancy, marked the start of a change in William. For the first time, he saw Annie and her family not as a reflection of his own expectations, but as an example of something far deeper, a resilience and strength he was only beginning to grasp. With a determination rarely seen outside his corporate world, William Smith decided to try to connect with his grandchildren. Julian and Olivia, with their carefree laughter and games, offered him a chance to connect with a part of his family he had neglected for years. But from the start, he realized this task would be harder than he'd anticipated. His first attempt drew on what he knew best, using his purchasing power to impress. One afternoon, he arrived home with carefully selected gifts he believed would surely make the children happy. From an elegant bag, he pulled out a state-of-the-art drone and a virtual reality video game. The children's eyes lit up at first with curiosity, but their enthusiasm soon faded as they realized they lacked the space and resources to use these toys. "Thank you, Grandpa," said Julian, always polite, as he carefully placed the drone in a corner. Olivia, with equal courtesy, glanced at the video game before returning to her drawing. William, used to more enthusiastic reactions, felt puzzled. Weren't these the gifts any child would want? He looked at Annie, hoping for a hint, but she only watched him with a slight smile, as if knowing this moment would come. Determined to try again, William sat with the children as they built a castle out of blocks. Julian, with the precision and patience of his age, assembled the colored blocks, while Olivia contributed ideas on which part of the castle should be taller. William, wanting to participate, began suggesting improvements and picking up blocks to optimize the structure. "No, Grandpa, not like that," said Julian, a bit frustrated when William moved one of the key pieces. "But if we do it this way, the castle will be more stable," William replied, applying his adult logic to the game. Julian sighed and stopped building, drifting away from the game. His interest in the castle vanished. William, accustomed to leading and controlling, hadn't considered that in children's play, the final result mattered far less than the joy of the process. That night, after the children had gone to sleep, William reflected on what had happened. For the first time, he realized he didn't know how to relate to them without imposing his vision. He was so used to directing and making decisions for others that he didn't know how to simply be present. The next day, he decided to change his approach. Instead of trying to direct the game, William joined the children while they colored on the living room floor. Olivia handed him a red pencil without a word, as if testing him, and Julian gave him a sheet of paper. "What should I draw?" William asked, feeling strangely out of place. "Whatever you want, Grandpa," Olivia replied naturally, focused on her own drawing. William took the pencil and began to draw clumsy lines. He sketched a tree, though its proportions were far from correct. Then he tried to add a sun, but the result looked more like an amorphous blob than a star. Despite his clear lack of skill, the children started to laugh, not mockingly, but delighted to see their grandfather stepping out of his comfort zone. "That's a very strange tree, Grandpa," Julian commented, laughing. "It's a tree with personality," William replied, surprising himself by enjoying the moment. As they continued drawing, William realized something he'd overlooked in all his previous attempts. He didn't need to impress his grandchildren or teach them anything. All they needed from him was his time, his presence, his willingness to share simple moments. For the first time, William allowed himself to relax. His rigid manner softened, and the image of the imposing magnate faded, giving way to a grandfather who, though clumsy and inexperienced in the children's world, was willing to learn. By the end of the afternoon, when Olivia showed him her finished drawing, a colorful landscape of whimsical shapes, William looked at it as if it were a priceless work of art. "It's beautiful, Olivia," he said sincerely. "Thanks, Grandpa. Can I put it on the fridge?" she asked, excited. "Of course, but only if we put my tree next to it," William replied with a genuine smile. The children laughed again, and for the first time, William felt he'd taken a small step toward them. It wasn't a perfect bond, nor an instant connection, but it was a start. That night, as he looked at the drawings stuck to the fridge, William understood that sometimes the most valuable things aren't what you can buy, but the time you're willing to give. Night had fallen, and Annie's apartment was immersed in a quiet rare during the day. The children were already asleep, and Sebastian had also retired to his room early. William sat in the living room with a cup of tea Annie had offered him. There was a light but palpable tension in the air, as if unspoken words hovered between them, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Annie appeared from the kitchen, drying her hands with a towel. Her face, though tired, showed a determination William had learned to recognize in recent days. She sat down across from him, hands folded on the low table, and looked him straight in the eye. "Dad, I want to tell you something," she began, her tone firm but not aggressive. William nodded, setting the cup aside. There was something in his gaze that reflected a mixture of anticipation and resignation, as if he knew this conversation would be difficult but necessary. "I always thought I had to be perfect for you to love me," Annie said, breaking the silence with a sincerity that hit William like a hammer. "Every time I failed, I felt like I was disappointing you, and what hurt the most was that you never said anything. You just looked at me as if I were invisible." William remained motionless, his eyes fixed on his daughter's face. Annie's words were a mixture of confession and reproach, but there was no anger in her voice, only a deep sadness that left him speechless. "I don't know how many times I tried to impress you, Dad," Annie continued, her voice trembling slightly. "I won awards, got the best grades, practiced for hours to make my recitals perfect. But it was never enough. There was always something I could improve, something I did wrong. And when I didn't achieve it, you wouldn't even scold me. You just looked at me, as if I didn't exist." William looked away, unable to hold her gaze under the weight of those words. In his mind, the memories of those moments resurfaced like fragments of a puzzle he had never bothered to solve. He had viewed his attitude as a way to motivate Annie, to prepare her for a world he believed to be ruthless and demanding. But now, listening to her, he understood that his coldness had not strengthened her. It had wounded her deeply. "Annie, He tried to say something, but the words got stuck in his throat. What could he say to his daughter that could undo years of hurt? Annie observed him in silence, giving him time to respond, but when no answer came, she went on. "I'm not telling you this to make you feel bad, Dad. I'm telling you because I need you to understand. I need you to know that the little girl who did everything to please you isn't here anymore. Now it's just me, with my mistakes and my successes, with this life I chose, as complicated as it might be. And though the past hurts, I've learned to live with it." William raised his eyes, and for the first time in years, they reflected something more than pride or control. They reflected vulnerability, a crack in the armor he had built over a lifetime. "I never wanted you to feel that way," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I always thought I was doing the right thing, preparing you to be strong, to face the world. But now I see I only pushed you away." Annie nodded slowly, as if those words were a small step toward understanding, but not enough to close the gap between them. "You're right," William continued, his voice gaining some strength. "I always wanted to shape you in my own way, but I never stopped to ask what you wanted. And I'm sorry, Annie. I'm sorry I didn't give you the support you needed, that I never listened to you." The sincerity in his voice surprised Annie. It wasn't common to hear her father apologize, much less admit his mistakes. Though his words couldn't erase the past, they represented a beginning, a sign that William was willing to change. "Thank you for saying that, Dad," Annie replied with a slight sigh. "But this isn't just about asking for forgiveness. It's about understanding that things don't fix themselves overnight. There are wounds that still need healing, and that will take time." William nodded, accepting her words humbly. He knew he couldn't go back in time or erase the years of distance, but for the first time, he was willing to face the consequences of his actions and work on rebuilding what remained of their relationship. That night, as silence returned to the living room, both sat immersed in thought. It wasn't a complete reconciliation, but it was a turning point. William understood that winning back the place he had lost in his daughter's life would require more than words. It would take patience, effort, and, above all, being present in a way he had never been before. For the first time in a long while, William felt he had taken a small step towards something deeper, the possibility of a real relationship with his daughter. And though still uncertain, it gave him a glimmer of hope. Dawn found Annie already awake, moving with almost automatic precision through her home's small kitchen. William, seated at the table with a cup of coffee in hand, silently watched how his daughter's day began long before anyone else opened their eyes. The smell of toast and the sound of boiling water filled the air as she prepared breakfast. Although her every movement revealed exhaustion, there was also something else, a love that infused each small action. William noticed that Annie never paused, not for a moment. After getting the children ready for school, she made sure Sebastian had everything he needed before rushing off to her part-time job. In the afternoon, she returned with shopping bags in hand, took care of the house, looked after Sebastian, and spent time with her children before starting the nighttime chores. It was an exhausting routine, repeated day after day, but Annie never complained. William, accustomed to watching from a distance, now saw the details he'd missed before. The way Annie smiled at Julian and Olivia, even when she was exhausted. How she placed a plate carefully in front of Sebastian, ensuring his comfort before sitting down to eat. Every gesture spoke of a strength William couldn't help but admire, though that admiration came with an uncomfortable feeling: guilt. One afternoon, while the children played in the living room, Annie sat on the floor holding an old toy truck in her hands. The worn-out toy had lost a wheel, and Julian had asked her to fix it. William, seated on the sofa, watched as Annie patiently tried to repair the truck with some glue and tape. Her expression was focused, yet tender. The scene, seemingly simple, struck William unexpectedly. There was something profoundly moving in seeing her invest so much effort into something so small, not because it was necessary, but because she knew how much it meant to her son. In that moment, William understood a truth he had ignored for years. Sacrifice isn't always about grand gestures, but about the small acts of love carried out daily, even when the exhaustion seems overwhelming. As he watched Annie work on the truck, William couldn't help but wonder if he would ever have been capable of doing the same. His entire life had centered on building his empire, on accumulating achievements and proving his worth through success. But here was his daughter, facing challenges he had never known, displaying a strength that left him speechless. That night, once everyone had gone to their rooms, William remained alone in the kitchen. On the table lay a photo album Annie had shown him days before. He opened it carefully, turning the pages while looking at images of a smiling, vibrant Annie. There she was in her childhood, proudly holding a math trophy. In another photo, sitting at the piano during one of her recitals. But behind those smiles, William now saw something he hadn't noticed before. A desperate quest for his approval, a constant effort to fill a void he had created with his coldness. Each page he turned was a reminder of the expectations he had imposed, of the moments he had chosen to be an unyielding mentor rather than a compassionate father. And now, sitting in that humble kitchen, surrounded by echoes of a life he didn't fully understand, William felt profoundly affected. For the first time, he not only faced the impact of his decisions on Annie's life, but also the possibility that all his success had come at the expense of what truly mattered. He closed the album with a sigh, letting his hands rest on its worn cover. The weight in his chest was hard to ignore, but alongside that weight, something began to awaken in him. The desire to change. He didn't know how to start, but he was determined to try. Because for the first time in a long time, William Smith understood that the legacy that truly mattered wasn't in the numbers of his empire, but in the relationships he still had a chance to rebuild. The following evening, William decided to visit one of his favorite places, a restaurant he had frequented for decades. Its decor was impeccable, with white tablecloths, shining chandeliers, and soft background music accentuating its exclusive atmosphere. William sat at a private table across from Raphael, his lifelong friend and confidant. They had shared countless lunches here, talking about business, strategies, and the masterful moves that had led them to the top. The conversation began, as always, with anecdotes about their early years in the business world. They laughed, recalling youthful mistakes and lessons that had shaped them into the men they were now. But as the conversation progressed, Raphael, who knew William better than anyone, noticed something different about his friend. There was a shadow in William's gaze, a lack of the energy and confidence that had always characterized him. "What's wrong, William?" Raphael asked, leaning slightly over the table. "You're not yourself. Business troubles?" William shook his head, taking a sip of wine before answering. "No, business is fine. Everything's in order, as always," he said, but his tone lacked its usual satisfaction. Raphael studied him carefully, letting the silence do its work. Finally, William sighed, as if admitting an internal defeat. "It's Annie," he said, his tone mixing weariness and melancholy. Raphael raised an eyebrow, surprised. William rarely spoke about his family, and when he did, it was superficial. This was new territory. "What's going on with her?" he asked, genuinely interested. William stared at his glass as if the wine might offer him the words he sought. "I always thought giving them everything materially was enough," he finally confessed. "I believed that providing a good education, a comfortable home, and everything they needed meant I was doing my duty as a father. But now I see maybe it wasn't." Raphael nodded slowly, giving him space to continue. "Our relationship is tense, distant. I don't know when it all broke down, but I'm starting to realize that maybe it never was what it should have been," William continued, his tone a mixture of wounded pride and regret. "I always wanted Annie to be strong, independent, but now I wonder if I confused those things with control." Raphael, who had witnessed William's meteoric rise at the expense of his personal life, didn't seem surprised. After a moment of reflection, he responded with a phrase that struck William more forcefully than he himself expected. "Success means nothing if you celebrate it alone." The words hung in the air while William tried to process them. Raphael was right, and that was the hardest thing to admit. He had spent his life building an empire, making sure his name was synonymous with success. But now, sitting in an elegant restaurant, surrounded by luxuries that no longer seemed so important, he realized he had no one with whom to truly share those triumphs. The conversation continued, but William remained introspective. When he finally returned home, that sense of emptiness followed him like a shadow. In the silence of the night, he headed to his study, where he still kept old photo albums and documents related to his business achievements. He opened one of the albums and began flipping through its pages. The images returned memories of moments he had once considered insignificant. Annie in a princess dress on her birthday, smiling in front of a cake he barely remembered buying. A family photo in which, although everyone was smiling, he was distractedly looking at his phone. The photographs were a silent testimony to the things he had prioritized and those he had left behind. Then he took a framed document from one of the shelves, the contract that had sealed his first major deal. It had marked the beginning of his empire, the moment he convinced himself that control and material success were all that mattered. But now, holding it in his hands, the figures and words that once filled him with pride seemed empty. It wasn't the weight of his achievements he felt, but the weight of the relationships he had sacrificed for them. He leaned back in his chair, letting the darkness of the room envelop him. For the first time, William began to question whether his priorities had been worth it. His life had been full of triumphs, but what did they mean when there was no one to share them with? That night, as he closed the album and returned the documents to their place, something changed in William. It wasn't a complete transformation, but the start of an internal shift. Raphael's words continued to echo in his mind, like a refrain he couldn't ignore. Success means nothing if you celebrate it alone. For the first time, William allowed himself to imagine a different future, one in which love and connection with his family were part of his legacy, not a painful absence. Morning at Annie's home began like any other. The aroma of fresh coffee and the soft crunch of toast filled the small apartment. Annie, as always, was on the move, serving breakfast to the children while Sebastian prepared his place at the table with Julian's help, as the boy insisted on being useful. William, seated at the other end of the table, watched it all with a mixture of curiosity and reflection. Despite his initial discomfort in that modest space, he had begun to grow accustomed to the rhythm of his daughter's life. The conversation at the table started lightly, with the children talking about their plans for the day, and Annie responding enthusiastically, though her voice carried a clear note of fatigue. William, feeling the need to participate, decided to make a comment he believed would be encouraging. "Annie was always strong, stronger than anyone could imagine," he said with a smile that aimed to be warm. "That's why I always supported her, even if from a distance." The silence that followed was palpable. Annie lowered her gaze to her plate, while Sebastian, seated beside her, paused for a moment before slowly turning to face William. His expression, usually serene, showed a mixture of disbelief and anger. "Supported?" Sebastian asked, his voice firm but controlled. The intensity in his words surprised everyone at the table. "In what way, exactly?" William frowned, not fully understanding why his words had provoked such a reaction. He tried to justify himself. "I always wanted what was best for her. I gave her everything she needed to succeed. A good education, stability. What more could she need?" Sebastian let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head as he rolled his chair back a bit to face William directly. "The only thing you did was impose your will and then disappear when she didn't obey," he replied, with a harshness none had expected from him. Annie, nervous, tried to intervene. "Sebastian, this isn't the time." But Sebastian raised a hand, asking her to let him continue. "No, Annie, this needs to be said." He turned his attention back to William. "Do you really think you supported her? because from where I stand, all you did was pressure her, judge her, and then step aside when she decided to live her own life." William, stunned, searched for words to respond. He wasn't used to being confronted like this, especially not in such an intimate setting. But before he could say anything, Sebastian continued, his voice now carrying a tone of pent-up frustration. "Annie doesn't need you to tell her how strong she is. She already knows. What she needs is for you to stop trying to control her life, even from afar. Your words, your expectations, even your attempts to help, all come with a weight she never asked to carry." Sebastian's words reverberated in the room, leaving William speechless. For the first time, someone was showing him with brutal honesty the consequences of his attitude, not only in Annie's life, but also in the family dynamic she had built. Annie, uncomfortable, tried to calm the situation. "Please, Sebastian, this isn't necessary." But William raised a hand, stopping her. Although his face reflected tension, there was something in his eyes suggesting he was willing to listen. "It's okay, Annie. Let him speak," he said, in a softer tone than anyone expected. Sebastian took a deep breath, as if his outburst of emotions had left him drained. Then he continued, this time more calmly, but no less firmly. "William, I know you want what's best for Annie, but wanting the best is not the same as knowing what's best. Sometimes all she needs is to know you're there, not with money, not with expectations, but simply there." William nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on the table as he processed what he had just heard. He wasn't used to being challenged in this manner, but he couldn't ignore the truth in Sebastian's words. For years, he had believed that his form of support was enough, but now he was beginning to see the cracks in his logic. Breakfast ended in silence, with the children oblivious to the tension lingering in the air. William remained seated at the table, while the others cleared the dishes, lost in thought. Sebastian's words had opened a door he could not close, and for the first time, he realized he could no longer justify his actions with good intentions. He needed to do something more. That day marked a turning point in William's relationship with Sebastian and, by extension, with Annie. Although the confrontation had been uncomfortable and difficult, it also gave William a new perspective. If he truly wanted to be part of his daughter's life, he would have to stop imposing his vision and learn to be the kind of support she needed, not the one he believed was right. William Smith had spent days reflecting on Sebastian's words. The confrontation at breakfast had been a dose of reality he could no longer ignore. For the first time, he understood that if he really wanted to help, he couldn't do it from the position of control he had always assumed. He had to find a way to be useful, without imposing his will, and more importantly, without undermining Sebastian's dignity or Annie's independence. One afternoon, while Sebastian sat in the living room organizing family documents, William approached him cautiously. In his hands he carried a notebook and a pen, tools that seemed somewhat out of place for someone used to contracts and electronic figures. "Sebastian, may I talk to you?" he asked, his tone softer than usual. Sebastian looked at him, somewhat distrustful, but nodded. "Go ahead." William sat down in front of him, placing the notebook on the table. "I've been thinking about something you could consider. I know you need to feel useful, not just for Annie and the kids, but for yourself. And I want to help you with that, but not as a favor or charity. I want to offer you a chance to build something of your own." Sebastian frowned, crossing his arms. "An opportunity?" he repeated, skepticism evident in his tone. William nodded, opening the notebook to show some notes and diagrams he had prepared. It was a simple but promising plan, a small, home-based business focused on designing and overseeing the production of custom products through a digital platform. William had thought of something that could fit Sebastian's abilities and also accommodate the physical limitations he faced. "I've talked to some contacts," William continued. "I can help you establish the initial connections to get started, but everything else will be up to you. The design, oversight, growth, it will be your project." Sebastian studied the diagrams in silence. The proposal was interesting, but it also stirred a mix of emotions. On the one hand, the possibility of regaining a sense of purpose was tempting. On the other, he couldn't help feeling this was another attempt by William to assert himself. "I appreciate the idea, William, but I don't need you to solve my life," he finally replied, his tone more defensive than he intended. William, anticipating the reaction, raised a hand as if to calm him. "This isn't a gift or a favor," he said, his voice surprisingly vulnerable. "It's a way for you to show what you're capable of, not just to others, but to yourself. I just want to help you take the first step, but whatever you build afterward will be yours." At that moment, Annie, who had been listening from the kitchen, entered the living room. She looked at Sebastian, whose face reflected an internal struggle, and then spoke to him with a gentle smile. "Sebastian, I think you should consider it," she said, sitting down beside him. "Not as something William is giving you, but as an opportunity to start over. I know how hard all of this has been for you, and I think this project could be a way to regain what you feel you lost." Sebastian looked at her, finding in her words a support that always strengthened him. Then he turned his attention back to William, who was watching him with an uncharacteristic patience. "Think of it as a foundation to build something new," Annie added. "Something you can share with us, but that is also yours alone." After several conversations and many hours of reflection, Sebastian finally agreed. William kept his word, limiting himself to providing the initial contacts and helping with the logistics to get the idea off the ground. From that point on, Sebastian took charge of the project, dedicating himself to designing the first products and overseeing every detail. As the business began to take shape, something curious happened between William and Sebastian. Though they didn't get along particularly well, the shared effort to make the project succeed created a bridge between them. William learned to step back and respect Sebastian's decisions, while Sebastian, still somewhat distrustful, began to see someone willing to support him without imposing conditions. Over time, the small business not only became an additional source of income for the family, but also allowed Sebastian to regain his confidence. The children, excited by the idea, became the project's biggest promoters, enthusiastically talking about Dad's designs at school. Annie, for her part, found comfort in seeing her husband smile more often, feeling less like a burden and more like the pillar he had always wanted to be. For William, the project's success wasn't about the numbers or the business contacts. It was about the connection he had begun to build, not just with Sebastian, but also with Annie and the children. It was a small step, but for him, it represented a new way of understanding what it truly meant to help his family. On the following sunny afternoon, Annie's backyard was filled with laughter and play. William, dressed more casually than usual, was sitting in a plastic chair, watching his grandchildren run back and forth with the boundless energy of childhood. Julian, the oldest, had settled near him with a notebook and pencil, focused on his drawings. William observed him out of the corner of his eye, silently enjoying the moment. For the first time in a long while, William felt different. He couldn't quite describe it, but there was something about that small corner of everyday life that made him want to stay there a bit longer. "What are you drawing?" he asked, breaking the silence. "A superhero," Julian answered without looking up. "But this one doesn't have a cape because he doesn't need it. He's strong without it." William smiled faintly. There was something refreshing in a child's logic, a simplicity that made everything seem clearer. Suddenly, Julian stopped drawing and looked up at his grandfather with a seriousness William didn't expect from a child his age. "Grandpa, why are you never happy?" he asked, with the innocent curiosity only a child could have. The question hit William like a bucket of cold water. He remained still for a moment, trying to process what he had just heard. "What do you mean, Julian?" he finally asked, trying to buy time as he searched for an answer. "You always look angry," Julian replied, shrugging his shoulders, "or like you're thinking about something. You never really look happy, like Mom when she plays with us." William tried to smile, but even he felt how forced it was. I am happy, Julian. It's just that, well, adults have a lot of things to think about. Julian looked at him, clearly unconvinced, but decided not to push the matter. He returned to his drawing, leaving William alone with his thoughts. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, William sat alone in the living room. Julian's words echoed in his mind. Why was he never happy? It was a question he had never allowed himself to ask, but now it seemed impossible to ignore. William reviewed his life in his mind, as if examining a financial statement. He had achieved everything he set out to do: a business empire, professional respect, a life of luxury. Yet as he sat in that humble home, surrounded by a family that had learned to survive without him, he could not help feeling that something had always been missing. Control, which had guided him throughout his life, now felt like a cage. He had controlled every aspect of his career, his businesses, even his family. But in the process, he had emotionally disconnected from everyone and everything. He had mistaken material success for happiness, and now, after decades, he was beginning to realize the emptiness he felt could not be filled with achievements or wealth. William thought about Annie, about the times he had seen her strive for his approval, the words he never said, and the moments they never shared. He thought about Sebastian, about the quiet strength with which he faced his own struggles. He thought about Julian and Olivia, about the joy they brought to every corner of the house. And in all of that, he realized that his legacy was not in the companies he built or the contracts he signed, but in the relationships he had neglected. For the first time in years, William accepted that the emptiness he always felt was not the result of something he still needed to accomplish, but something he needed to give. He had spent so much time focusing on what he could build and control that he never allowed himself to simply be present for the people who mattered. That night, as the rest of the house slept, William made himself a promise. It was not too late to change. He had lost time, yes, but not everything was lost. He could still work to be a better father, a better grandfather, a better human being. He didn't know where to start, but he knew the answer was not in material achievements. It lay in simple moments, like laughter in the backyard or a drawing shared with his grandson. And for the first time in a long while, William Smith felt a glimmer of something he had been seeking all his life: hope. The night was peaceful, and Annie's home was wrapped in a silence William still wasn't used to enjoying. The children slept soundly in their rooms, and Sebastian had retired early, exhausted after working on the budding business. Annie was in the kitchen, washing the last dishes of the day, while William sat on the sofa, holding a cup of tea Annie had served him minutes before. Weeks had passed since William had settled in the house, and although the days had been filled with small steps forward, there was still a weight hanging in the air between them, a conversation both knew they would eventually have. When Annie came into the living room and sat in the chair across from him, William felt that the moment had arrived. He set his cup aside and looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mix of regret and determination. "Annie," he began, speaking softly and cautiously, "I know I can't change the past, but I want you to know I'm sorry. I'm sorry for the times I wasn't there for you, for the words I never said, for the moments I made you feel you weren't enough." Annie listened in silence, but before he could continue, she raised her hand to stop him. There was no anger on her face, but there was a firmness William recognized immediately. "It's not just what you did, Dad," she said, her tone calm but containing years of pent-up reflections and emotions. "It's what you never did." William looked at her surprised while she went on. "You never hugged me when I needed it. You never told me you were proud of me, not even when I tried my hardest to impress you. I always thought I had to be perfect for you to love me. And when I failed, I felt worthless." Annie's words were like a mirror reflecting all of William's decisions and attitudes under a light he had never considered before. His daughter, the strong and independent woman sitting before him, had built that strength on the wounds he himself had inflicted. William lowered his head, his hands trembling slightly as he tried to process what he was hearing. He had faced criticism in business, lost opportunities, and dealt with unimaginable pressure, but nothing had prepared him for this kind of honesty. "I always wanted you to be strong," he murmured, almost as an apology. "I thought it was my duty to prepare you for the world, so you would never have to depend on anyone." Annie looked him straight in the eye, her voice gentle but unyielding. "And what about depending on you, Dad?" she asked. "What about feeling I could trust you, not as a mentor or a judge, but as my father?" William did not answer. For the first time in his life, he had no response. He could only nod slowly, letting Annie continue. "I pushed you away because I didn't know how to be myself around you," she confessed, and her words echoed painfully in the room. "I felt I had to choose between meeting your expectations or finding out who I really was. And I chose to distance myself because it was the only way I could feel free." Tears began to fill William's eyes, but he made no attempt to hide them. Annie's words struck directly at his defenses, but they were also a balm, because although they were painful, they also carried the hope of a truth that could be shared. "I never realized how much I was hurting you," he finally admitted, his voice broken with emotion. "I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I see I was just imposing my understanding of the world on you, and that cost you more than I ever imagined." Annie nodded, but this time her gaze held no reproach, only understanding. The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was as though both of them were processing the words, letting them settle in their hearts. William, still with tears in his eyes, extended a hand toward his daughter. Annie hesitated for a moment, but finally took it. It was a small gesture, but within that handshake lay a promise to work together, to rebuild what had been broken. That night, William understood that true strength was not found in control or perfection, but in vulnerability. And Annie, despite everything she had faced, showed him there was always room to start again. It was a long road, but for the first time, both were willing to travel it together. In the days following William and Annie's conversation, there was a subtle but significant change in their relationship. William, aware that words alone could not repair years of distance, decided to act in a way he was not used to, with humility and patience. There was something liberating about setting aside the quick fixes he had always offered, especially those related to money or power. Instead of trying to fix everything from a position of control, William began to involve himself in the small tasks of daily life, gestures he once would have considered insignificant, but which he now understood were essential. One morning, as Annie got ready to take the children to school, William offered to do it himself. "Are you sure?" asked Annie, with a mix of skepticism and surprise. "Of course," William replied, taking Julian's and Olivia's backpacks with a smile. "How hard can it be?" The ride to school wasn't perfect. William, accustomed to chauffeured luxury cars, felt a bit clumsy navigating the traffic in Annie's modest vehicle. However, the children made him feel like a hero, laughing at his attempts to remember the directions and encouraging him with stories about their classes. By the time they arrived, William felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being part of a simple yet meaningful family moment. Another day, he decided to try something even more unusual for him: cooking. With a recipe he found in a magazine from the living room, he set out to prepare a meal for Annie and Sebastian. The result was a disaster. The rice stuck to the bottom of the pot, the meat was overcooked, and the salad had too much vinegar. But when the children began to laugh and applaud his effort, William couldn't help joining in their laughter. "Maybe I'm not a chef," he admitted with a crooked smile, "but I promise to get better." Annie, while clearing the dishes, noticed something in her father that she had never seen before: a genuine effort to connect, even if it meant making mistakes. One afternoon, as the family enjoyed a walk in the park, William found himself playing with the kids. Olivia convinced him to push her on the swing, while Julian challenged him to a race on the grass. Annie and Sebastian, sitting on a nearby bench, watched the scene in amazement. "I've never seen him like this," Annie commented, clasping her hands in her lap. "It's strange, but it feels different." Sebastian, always analytical, nodded. "Maybe he's learning from you more than you realize." Annie let out a soft laugh, but the idea lingered in her mind. It was true that her father still had much to prove, but the gestures he was making now had a quality she had never seen in him before: authenticity. Of course, not everything was harmonious. William was still a man accustomed to giving his opinion and sometimes to imposing his view. On one occasion, while Annie discussed the household finances with Sebastian, William couldn't resist suggesting changes that he believed would be more efficient. "Dad, I appreciate your ideas, but Sebastian and I know what we're doing," Annie responded, calm but firm. William, feeling the impulse to insist, decided to remain silent. As difficult as it was, he understood that his role at that moment was not to dictate how Annie should run her life, but to respect her decisions. Despite these occasional tensions, Annie began to notice that her conversations with her father flowed differently. They no longer felt like a battle for control, but rather an attempt at genuine closeness. William also started listening more and talking less, observing how even his smallest words could affect his daughter. On a quiet afternoon, while the children were drawing in the living room, William and Annie shared a moment together in the kitchen. William, who had learned to let silences speak for themselves, took a moment to look at his daughter. "Thank you for giving me this chance," he finally said, in a tone Annie recognized as sincere. Annie, still cautious, smiled. "Thank you for trying, Dad. That means a lot to me." Although the wounds of the past were not fully healed, both knew they were making progress. William's simple gestures, though small, made a noticeable difference. For Annie, every step her father took in this new direction was a sign that maybe real change was possible. And so, amid laughter, tensions, and learning moments, they began to build something they'd never had before, a relationship based on mutual understanding and the desire to be truly present for one another. The makeshift workshop in Annie's small backyard had become the heart of Sebastian's new project. Though rudimentary, the space had everything he needed: basic tools, a work table, and a corner filled with recycled wood Annie had patiently gathered. There, Sebastian spent hours designing and crafting handmade furniture, pieces that combined functionality with a unique style reflecting his creativity and skill. William, who had initially encouraged the business, watched from a distance as the project came to life. In the past, he would have insisted on being in command, supervising every detail and ensuring everything met his standards. But this time, he forced himself to step back. His role was limited to providing occasional contacts and offering resources when asked. It was an exercise in humility and trust, something new for him, but necessary. Annie, always practical and organized, became the administrative engine of the business. She designed a simple but efficient system to keep track of accounts, maintain inventory, and coordinate orders. With her knowledge of social media, she began promoting the furniture online, posting photos of the finished pieces, and emphasizing their use of recycled materials. Responses were quick to appear. "Sebastian, we have 2 more orders," Annie said one afternoon, showing him her phone enthusiastically. "It looks like people are really interested in what we're doing." Sebastian, who was sanding a small table, looked up with a smile. Every new order validated his efforts and reminded him that, despite the challenges, he was still capable of contributing. The children also got involved spontaneously. Julian and Olivia, excited about the family business, became its first promoters. They talked about the furniture to their friends at school and helped Annie organize the photos she posted online. Observing them, William couldn't help feeling moved. The project was not only transforming Sebastian, but also strengthening the entire family. One afternoon, while working on a large order, Sebastian asked William for help moving a heavy piece. The 2 men worked silently for a while, each lost in his own thoughts. Finally, Sebastian broke the silence. "I never thought I could feel useful again," he said, his tone a mix of gratitude and caution. "I'm not sure if I should thank you or keep thinking this is part of your control." William set the tools aside and looked at Sebastian. There was a moment of tension, but then, to Sebastian's surprise, William smiled and shook his head. "You don't need to thank me," William replied, his sincerity disarming Sebastian. "This is yours, not mine. I just helped open the door. You were the one who decided to step through." William's words hung in the air, and for the first time, Sebastian looked at him with something other than distrust. There was a budding respect between them, an understanding beginning to form through the shared project. Over time, the business began to gain traction. Orders multiplied, and each delivered piece was a small victory for the family. Although the work was demanding, the satisfaction of seeing the results made it all worthwhile. Their economic stability also improved, easing some of the pressure Annie had carried for so long. However, the project's impact went beyond economics. Working together allowed Annie and Sebastian to strengthen their relationship. As Sebastian regained his sense of purpose, he also found new ways to support Annie emotionally, showing his gratitude through small gestures for all she had done for him and their family. Annie, for her part, rediscovered in Sebastian the optimistic and creative man she had always admired. For William, the business's success was a lesson in itself. He had entered Annie's life believing that his role was to fix everything with his experience and resources. But what truly made a difference was learning to give them space, trusting that they could find their own path. One night, during a family dinner, Julian announced excitedly, "My friends said they want a desk like the one we made." Everyone laughed, and William, seated at one corner of the table, watched the scene with a smile. It was a simple moment, but filled with meaning. For the first time, he felt he was part of something real, something not measured by numbers or contracts. Sebastian's business wasn't just a successful enterprise, it symbolized what the family could achieve when they worked together. As William looked at Annie and Sebastian, he realized that true legacy wasn't found in buildings or bank accounts, but in the bonds he was finally helping to rebuild. The table was carefully set, with a simple but clean tablecloth, plates arranged neatly, and a bouquet of fresh flowers in the center. Annie had made sure everything was perfect for the occasion. It was a family dinner, something seemingly ordinary, but for them it held special meaning. It was the first time William participated in such an intimate, everyday gathering with the entire family. Laura, William's wife, had arrived earlier that day, greeting Annie and the children warmly. Although she had always been present in William's life, time and past priorities had created an emotional distance between them that had never been openly discussed. Seeing William so involved in Annie's and his grandchildren's lives stirred a mix of surprise and hope in her. During dinner, conversation flowed naturally. The children, always full of energy, chatted animatedly about their day's activities. William, seated next to Julian, listened with an attentiveness that was new to everyone. Laura, at the other end of the table, watched with a blend of astonishment and pride as her husband interacted with a lightness that hadn't been common in him before. At one point, Olivia, with the spontaneity typical of her age, looked at her grandfather and made an observation that made everyone laugh. "Grandpa always looks serious, but now I see him smile more," she said, grinning broadly. The innocence of her words triggered a round of laughter, even from William, who rarely allowed himself to laugh openly. But when the laughter subsided, a reflective air remained. William remained still for a moment, looking at his granddaughter, then at Annie and Sebastian. Something inside him seemed to shift, something that had been buried for years. With a trembling voice, William stood up. That gesture alone drew everyone's attention. He wasn't a man who usually displayed vulnerability, especially not in a family setting. "I want to say something," he began, his eyes scanning the table until they rested on Annie. There was an expectant silence as William searched for the right words. Finally, he took a deep breath and continued. "I always thought that success meant giving you everything I never had, A good life, stability, opportunities. But I never understood that what you really needed was something I didn't know how to give. My time, my attention, my love." William paused, his voice faltering slightly. His eyes, now filled with tears, reflected deep regret. "It wasn't for lack of interest, Annie," he said, addressing his daughter directly. "I just didn't know how. I thought I was doing my best, but now I see how wrong I was. I imposed my expectations on you, pushed you away with my coldness, and never stopped to listen to what you truly wanted or needed from me." Annie, unable to hold back, let out a sob. Tears began to roll down her cheeks as she heard the words she had waited years to hear. "Sebastian, you've also been a victim of my ways," William continued, turning to his son-in-law. "I've been condescending and critical when all I should have done was support you. You and Annie have built something wonderful, and I just want to be part of it in whatever way you allow." Silence filled the room. Laura, moved by her husband's sincerity, clutched her napkin gently. Sebastian, always reserved, nodded quietly, but there was something new in his expression, an acceptance that had once seemed distant. William sat down again, letting his words settle. Annie was the one who broke the silence, her voice still trembling but filled with warmth. "Thank you, Dad," she said, wiping her tears. "I know it hasn't been easy for you, and I can't say everything is forgotten, but this means a lot to me." The dinner continued, but the atmosphere had changed. It was as if William's words had cleared the air, allowing the family to move forward into a new chapter. The laughter returned, the children resumed their stories, and Laura became more actively involved in the conversation, noting that for the first time in years, William seemed truly present. That night, when everyone said their goodbyes, William stayed a few minutes longer in the living room, watching Annie turn off the lights and take care of the last details. Something in his demeanor reflected relief, but also a renewed determination. He knew that his apology didn't erase the past, but it had opened a door. For the first time in a long time, William didn't feel like the imposing magnate who needed to have all the answers. He felt simply like a father and a grandfather, willing to accept his mistakes and work to be better. And that night, seeing his family together, he felt he was on the right path. As the months passed, life in Annie's home began to find a new balance, one in which William Smith gradually became a constant and, more importantly, a meaningful presence. He wasn't perfect, not by any means, but every day he made an effort to show through his actions what he had promised with his words. One morning, William was sitting in the living room, watching Annie from a distance. The family routine unfolded around him with a synchronicity he had never imagined possible. Annie was in the kitchen, preparing breakfast while helping Julian with a math problem. Olivia, with a mischievous smile, was drawing something in her notebook as she waited her turn. Meanwhile, Sebastian was reviewing the final details of an order for the business, consulting Annie now and then. The organized chaos of the scene had a warmth William couldn't stop admiring. For the first time, he didn't see Annie as the little girl he once tried to mold, nor as the daughter who had distanced herself from him. He saw her as a strong, loving, resilient woman who had built a life full of meaning despite her father's mistakes. The pride he felt wasn't tied to material achievements or goals met. It was a pride born of understanding who his daughter was and how much she had accomplished by staying true to herself. A few days later, William visited his office in the city, a place that had been his refuge and stronghold for decades. The walls were decorated with photographs of key moments in his career. The first important contract he signed, the inauguration of his first building, meetings with influential figures in the business world. Each image was a reminder of the years he had dedicated to building his empire. But now, looking at them, he felt something different. Instead of satisfaction, the photographs seemed empty, lacking the meaning he had once attributed to them. His gaze settled on a framed photo showing the exterior of his first building, a symbol of his success. Without thinking too much, he took it down and, with a deliberate gesture, replaced it with a recent photo of Annie, Sebastian, and the children, taken during an afternoon in the park. In the image, they were all laughing, their expressions full of life and closeness. William stared at the photo for a long moment, and for the first time in years, he felt he was beginning to understand what truly mattered. This simple act, though symbolic, marked a profound change in his perspective. It wasn't about disowning his success, but about understanding that the most valuable legacy wasn't in what he had built with bricks and contracts, but in the relationships he could still heal and strengthen. This change culminated at a school event for William's grandchildren. It was a simple presentation, with drawings and brief speeches that the children had prepared for their families. In the past, William would have considered such an event a waste of time, unimportant in his busy schedule. But that day, he arrived early, wearing a genuine smile and holding a camera Julian and Olivia had insisted he use. As the children presented their drawings and read their texts in front of the audience, William watched them with a mixture of pride and tenderness. Annie, standing on one side of the room, observed him from a distance. For the first time, she didn't see the controlling, cold magnate he used to be, but a present grandfather, fully immersed in his grandchildren's lives. When the event ended, Julian and Olivia ran to William with laughter and hugs. He lifted them into the air, laughing with them, enjoying the moment without reservation. Annie, seeing him like this, couldn't help smiling. Although the wounds of the past weren't fully healed, it was clear that something fundamental had changed. That night, as everyone sat down to dinner together, the atmosphere was filled with a warmth that couldn't be faked. William, for the first time, felt truly part of that family, not as an intruder or a stranger, but as someone who had found his place. The journey hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead. But William understood that success wasn't measured in figures or titles, but in the relationships we build and the impact we have on the people we love. As the laughter of his grandchildren filled the room, William Smith allowed himself something he had avoided all his life: feeling happy. Thanks for joining us in this story. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss upcoming stories. See you in the next video.